Great opportunity for me. I'm thankful for having it to speak to people here and online, and especially in that part of Central Europe that, for reasons we could discuss, I'm not focusing on in my book on Central Europe, but there would be really interesting things to say about Austria as Central Europe. And we discussed it a little bit this morning when I was part of Yanis's class. So East-West relations in Europe, how colonial, how racist, I think that this is something that so many of us are asking ourselves these days, those people who work on Central and Eastern Europe. So I approached this topic with some trepidation, because so much can be said about it, and our thinking as scholars on this topic is evolving. So we're still learning. Certainly, I don't mean this talk to be something final, but more I hope that it'll give people some questions as well as answers that are interesting. So during the lecture, what I'd like to do is, first, I'd like to talk about Eastern Europe and coloniality, because colonial and racial. And here, the sort of major theorist that I would like to refer to is the Peruvian scholar Aníbal Quijano. And then I move to race. And when I talk about race, I focus on racial capitalism, because I do this already in the book, and I'd like to do it more in my work. I borrow ideas, build ideas upon the work of Cedric Robinson, who, as you know, is an African-American scholar whose work is now kind of, I would say, being revived. And then, if we have time, I'd like to talk about why so many people say that we should not talk about race, not racism against Eastern Europeans. So far, my experience is that people very often will agree with me on everything, but then they will say it's not race. And I think, why is it not race? Not race, okay? Because that word makes your blood pressure go up. And I have to admit, I had the same reaction when I first thought about this. You know, I said, not race, it doesn't work. But I didn't know why it doesn't work. So later I gave up in conversations with myself and with other people. And I thought, no, actually, you know, there's really good reason to use the term race. So we're going to get to that. So I think it needs to be noted at the beginning that when we say colonial and racist, that's why I ask how colonial and how racist, because if Central Europe is connectable to coloniality and to racism, they're neither the typical coloniality, which would be that of the global South, nor the typical racism, which would be that especially of Black Americans. I think of those as the prototypical cases, where no one would ever doubt that it's racism. But once you get to other similar, I think, things, then questions may arise. So when we talk about the colonial part, Eastern Europe and people from there and they're living there have been seen ambiguously, correctly so, as both benefiting from colonialism, and after all, they're Europeans, and also colonizing others. So, for example, Polish landlords colonized, quote unquote, oppressed, I think is better, Ukrainian serfs. Hungarian landlords did the same to Romanian and Slovak serfs, or Germans to Czechs. So I think that Eastern European as colonizer is debatable that they were also colonizing subjects, colonizers. And then that they were colonized. Now here we'd be looking at colonized by who? And a lot of scholars now, especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine, like to speak about the colonizers as the Soviet Union, Russia. Okay, but it's not new though. In my book, I mentioned this goes back several decades. And so I would say that even the majority of those who want to talk about Central and Eastern Europe as colonized are thinking by Russia or by the Soviet Union. I'm not going to talk about this unless you ask me a question. My focus is on how they are, if they are, colonized by the West. And this idea that Central Europe is colonized by the West is very popular about very unpleasant right-wing fascist nationalist types like Viktor Orban. So for me to talk about it, or for others to talk about it, there is a danger that we will be misperceived as supporting the rhetoric of people like Orban. Nothing is farther from what I'd like to do, but I think that if we leave this topic to the likes of Orban, it's going to stay there. And it's a powerful topic that motivates people in Central Europe to support illiberal movements and turn away from liberal democracy, which they see perhaps as colonizing them. Now, what Orban means by colonize is simply oppressed. There is no technical analysis there. Colonized. And I must say, it's the same with people who think that they're colonized by the Soviet Union. They just mean oppressed. It's not necessarily some technical definition, but I would like to speak about coloniality more specifically and see whether it makes sense to go beyond just oppression and to argue that Eastern Europe somehow has relations to the West, similar to those of the global South to the global North. Okay, so the literature is immense. The number of people today who are talking about coloniality in connection with Central and Eastern Europe, like I said, mostly from Russia, but also from the West, in many different ways. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars working. Alice and I were in Philadelphia at the meeting of the Association of East European and Eurasian Studies, and the theme was decolonialization. So, like every day from 8 a.m. until 4 a.m., there were like panels of 4 or 5 people talking about this subject. Okay, so I decided not to cover here the literature as such, but Tomasz Zaritsky does review it. Already some years ago, the Polish scholar Zaritsky reviewed it, and he found that left-wing people and liberal intellectuals, they like to look at Poland specifically in that case, but Central Europe as guilty of colonialism towards others. And here maybe because it just means oppression, they often include anti-Semitism relations to Jews. Whereas those who complain that the West is colonizing them, they tend to be right-wing. However, there are real exceptions, important exceptions to that. And there are people who have already 10, 20 years ago started to talk about this topic from the left or progressive perspective. For example, Joseph Goebbels. So, and it's increasing, and I would put myself there too. So the ambiguity, to get back to that, when we come to racism, is similar to coloniality, that there is racism against Eastern Europeans, but also there's racism by Eastern Europeans. And in my work, I like to connect them. They're two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. I'm very much opposed to speaking of racism as somehow particularly Eastern European, but Eastern European racism, in my opinion, is connected to racism against Eastern Europeans. Just to lay a bit of a theoretical foundation, When we talk about coloniality, I already mentioned about Quijano. And when we talk about racial capitalism, I mentioned Cedric Robinson. I think Manuel of Huatka should be singled out as already for many years, if not decades, talking about coloniality from this Latin American perspective, initiated perhaps by Quijano and others like Dussel. And Gorgi Bhattacharya in the UK is one of the people who are updating Cedric Robinson's work. But I put plus there, not because I'm giving it 4 stars out of 5 or something, but because there are so many other people that are also doing it. And both of these theories connect coloniality and racialization. So let's start with Robinson's racial capitalism, and his major book is Black Marxism, 1983, but it's been republished more recently. And I relate it to the work of Wallerstein. Immanuel Wallerstein is better known perhaps, and how Wallerstein contrasts the core versus the periphery in a capitalist world system. The core accumulates capital and the periphery provides labor and resources. Okay, so that's, let's keep this in mind because I'd like to build on this distinction between core and periphery, capital accumulation and labor and resource extraction as I go on with this talk. This distinction, according to Robinson, such a distinction, because it's not exactly the same as Wallerstein's, but for our purposes, we can simplify it that way. And this distinction between an accumulating core and periphery providing labor is reflected always in language and discourses in othering, which justifies it. Okay? And that's what racism is on my reading of Cedric Robinson. It's the discursive aspect of exploitation. Okay? So once you have capital accumulation restricted to some group, then that group benefits from language that inferiorizes the labor providing group. Okay? And so he calls it, and I would like to call it, racism. Robinson never speaks about race without also class being in mind somewhere very near, so that in his, some of his work in Black Marxism, there's an important chapter on the English working class and how the English working class developed in an effort to limit the potential of the Irish workers in England. Okay, so that actually the study of the working class, which is so fundamental to Karl Marx, according to Cedric Robinson, is based not on universal situations of the working class, but on the specifically English situation, where the English working class mobilized and formed labor unions and so forth. But according to Robinson, what that classic Marxist story forgets is that the workers mobilized against the Irish workers. Okay, so their class interests didn't come through as much as Marx would have liked, and they were complicated by race. According to him, Robinson, I quote in here, racism is not an epidemic thing in its essence. It's not about being black or white or skin color. And this is a quote from Robinson. 2020 is just a reprint of 1983. Racism, I maintain, was not simply a convention for ordering the relations of European to non-European peoples, but has its genesis in the internal relations of European peoples. Okay, so let's keep that in mind too, because when we talk about can we call it racism if it's not a matter of color, Robinson certainly would say yes. Quijano Here, a quote from Quijano will be useful on the origins of race. So you could read it with me. The formation of the global world of capitalism gave birth to a structure of power whose crucial elements were, on the one hand, the articulation of different relations of exploitation, work, slavery, serfdom, reciprocity, wage labor, small commercial production around capital and its market. On the other hand, the production of new historical identities, Indian, black, white, mestizo. So these identities are races. And what Quijano is saying that this is the origin of race. Okay. According to him, it began in Latin America. When the Iberian colonizers organized the labor of both indigenous people and imported enslaved people and mestizos, they organized that labor so that it would fit into a global capitalist system. And according to Quijano, that was the beginning of both modern capitalism and racism. So just like Robinson, he thinks that colonialism and racism go hand in hand together. Okay, so now let's ask ourselves, if we use colonialism in a technical sense, not coloniality, not just oppression, but how much is the situation of Eastern Europeans like that of Latin Americans who are not white? Okay, that's how I think we need to ask the question if we take this Quijano style approach, right? And I don't think until 1989 it was that similar. There were similarities, but there were pretty big differences. So let's look at that. So according to Quijano, wage labor in the colonies, and I don't think he means only Latin America, at the beginning of the colonial period and imperialism, wage labor was restricted to white people. Other people had to engage in all kinds of forms of unfree or semi-free or reciprocal, he calls it, labor, where you would get, shelter and food and stuff like that, but not cash. So the modern wage labor in Latin America was reserved to whites. Incidentally, he points out in a footnote that people from Poland were among the white people who were welcome in Latin America as white people, and they were admitted to wage labor, although this would be a little later than the beginning of colonialism. Now, if we ask if in Eastern Europe there's also a situation where labor is not all free, yes. I think that especially, above all, serfdom, or so-called new serfdom, which just exactly at that time was organized in Central and Eastern Europe, even Eastern Germany and some of Austria, was organized in a fashion that revived serfdom when it was already disappearing in Western Europe. And according to Manuela Boatka and others, this new serfdom fit into the same world economic system that unfree labor in the Americas fit into. Quijano says that the indigenous people, so-called Indians, were serfs and Africans were slaves. So unfree forms of labor. But when we look at Eastern Europe, we also see something like racial differentiation, it's ethnic differentiation. I don't want to probably have time right now to defend the distinction between ethnic and race. But again, if somebody asks me, I'll be happy to go there. So like I mentioned, the Poles and the Ukrainians, Hungarians and Romanians, that kind of ethnic differentiation existed in Central Europe. In Russia, according to Etkin, it didn't, so it was a kind of only a class type of racism, if you can call it that, of the aristocracy towards the pet serfs. And that's been objected to by Tlostanova, who says, well, that's because Etkin didn't look at the subordination of non-Russian people in the Russian Empire. Okay, so, but by the end of the 19th century, and that's when imperialism was at its height in Europe, by the end of the 19th century, wage labor was dominant in East Central Europe and also in the colonies. You know, people were getting wages at that time. So the similarity is increasing, but it's not the case that there was the same kind of capital accumulation versus labor dynamic between East Central Europeans and the West. Okay, so we cannot compare the relations that late 19th century Bohemia or Poland or Hungary had to England to those that India had to England. They are not the same, although we see a continuation of that ethnic difference, so that often in Central European countries, there was an ethnic division between the capitalists and the workers, which, you know, it wasn't legislated, it was a tendency, okay, with many exceptions. But I don't think that we can say that Eastern Europe was colonial in the Quijano sense. It resembled colonial relations, but less so than it would after 1989. And how is it that after 1989, this parallel between what was the colonies and what was socialist countries becomes a little, to me, more convincingly colonial? So now we're looking at capitalism in a new phase. Okay? Optimistic anti-capitalists like to call it late capitalism, but although I'm an optimist, I'm not that much of an optimist. And I'm talking about neoliberal globalization. Okay? So the undoing of national barriers in the path of capital accumulation and capital expansion. And that's a phase of racial capitalism when Western capital in 1989 was triumphed. It seemed like the end of history, as you know, to some people. And so now it has a new character. What are its major features that are relevant to our topic? First of all, outsourcing. So the sending of contracts for labor, the extraction of labor that was extracted in the West, now extracted in the ex-colonies, if we limit ourselves to the post-colony, and also migration, people from the post-colony coming into the West, and again, you know, competing, their labor extraction becoming a major part of labor extraction in the West, where they compete with the local working class. Okay, so now if you look at the screen and you see outsourcing and migration, it's also what happened to the post-socialist countries after 1989. Okay, they became workshop economies. Okay, in Czech it's called montovna, like a assembly shop, kind of put together stuff shop. And they became a source of migration, not the same in every country, but millions of people migrated to Poland, from Poland, as well as to from Poland to the UK, for example, and we know the Brexit debate was very much about that. So now I see that there is a real similarity between the post-colony and the post-socialist area. And then 2004, with the expansion of the European Union and eventually the ability of Central Europeans to move for work to Western Europe, this has become a really striking similarity. So, yeah, so I'm suggesting that after 1989 is when East-West relations in Europe and North-South relations both fit the Robinsonian model. And the Robinsonian model is capital accumulation in one place, labor extraction from another place, accompanied by discourse, which Robinson would call racist, and I like to call racist. Okay, so let's look at racism. And again, racism against Eastern Europeans is different after 1989. Okay, the very few people that actually know my book, some of them have criticized me for saying that that racism against Eastern Europeans is something new. You know, like I know it's a slow read sometimes, but I have 3 chapters on how it developed to where we are now. Okay, and I'm not saying that it's new, but racism against Europeans after 1989 is different. Okay, and more important, I think. I like to say that after 1989, Eastern Europeans became not more white, but less white. And so what am I talking about? So first of all, the historic foundation is such that racism against Eastern Europeans continues to use the tropes of several things that I'm going to list. It amalgamates their language. So for example, Orientalism is very important. I don't know why I put it in parentheses, I think, because that extends beyond Eastern Europe. So racism against Eastern Europeans is part of Orientalism. Anti-Slavism, very importantly. German expansionism, I learned this from Yanis when we were in Philadelphia, that I'm not paying enough attention to the German idea of the Osten, beyond Poland, Osten, like going towards Russia, Ukraine, and so far, and Yanis is so correct. And I would say Russophobia. Okay, these are all languages, discourses that do get reflected in how people are talked about in the West, people who live or come from the East. And Balkanism, that's another species. So you know, we talked this morning about how Vienna is where the Balkans began. And you know, what is the sensibility in that statement, you know? But I think to make a long story short, I think we're dealing here with inter-imperiality. Okay, so Russophobia, competition with the Russian Empire, and Balkanism, competition with the Ottoman Empire, okay, which are really both also forms of Orientalism. But, okay, so then there are other sort of classic tropes that aren't only about Eastern Europeans. So the racism against migrants from Eastern Europe is not so different from racism against people from the global South. They're criminal, they bring diseases. Alexander Levitsky has written interesting stuff about this, as well as dozens and dozens of other people. And also the racism against people who stay in Eastern Europe. Okay, so there it's not specifically Eastern European. That's why I put Orientalism in parentheses. It's part of sort of general Orientalism. Okay, I do recognize this. It's very important and very fruitful for research. But I do think that there are also new tropes since 1989 against Eastern Europeans, which do not reflect either anti-Slavism, Balkanism, or any of these things. And what are they? So they have to do with the worst side of capitalism. Corrupt capitalism, I call it. The area is full of gangsters and prostitutes, and it's like a gendered attack on the area, which is quite interesting. And the capitalists there are all oligarchs. I show in my book even even capitalists who are not closer to the government than any in the West are called oligarchs just because they're Eastern European capitalists. Yet oligarchs should mean running the country and close to the government. And so, in my opinion, what we don't look at enough is not just issues of labor, but issues of capital. Okay? And that there is competition between transnational and national capital. I talk about this in the book, and since the book, I found out that there's more literature than I was then even familiar with, also growing literature on national capitalists. So I will mention Agnes Gaggi and Gabor Scheiring and Adam Fabry. And I think that it's also very interesting to look at the work of Dorit Geva, who's now joining the University of Vienna, and there are really many other people doing this kind of very promising work. And so I feel that we need to look at the competition between Western capital and Eastern capital. And so this idea of them all being oligarchs and gangsters reinforces the restriction of capital accumulation to the West in competition with local capital, and provokes an illiberal reaction led in many ways by these national capitalists in a kind of alliance with some parts of labor in the area. And, so corrupt capitalism is one of the new tropes post-1989, I would say. And the other is that Eastern Europeans are congenitally given to some disgusting things like racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and also ultimately authoritarianism. That the reason they suffer from these phenomena is that they're Eastern Europeans. Okay? Not because they're part of a world in which such things are also seen in America and in Western Europe. And I've even seen a statement like, where a writer recognized that it happens in Western and Eastern Europe, but said, of course it's different in Eastern Europe. And I couldn't figure out what he meant by of course, because there was no reason given for it whatsoever. Okay, so really what we're talking about is a racism against racists. Okay, and I think we need to connect those two things. I'm not going to do it here today, but I try to do it in my work. But what I will point to is that it might be a kind of psychological ploy where you try to deal with the fact that your own society is racist and Islamophobic, homophobic, sexist, anti-Semitic. What else did I leave out? And that, but they are even more so. Okay, so comparatively speaking, we are fine because they're even worse, right? And also, we probably can't really get rid of it because it's universal. I mean, look, even they have this problem. Okay, so I think this is where I'm perhaps being the boldest, and you might disagree with me, but I think the very notion of Central and Eastern Europe is built on this post-1989 racism. Because after 1989, there is no real reason to talk about Central and Eastern Europe, I think, unless you're specifically talking about the lasting effects of socialism, which are important. So yes, I can see why you would want to talk about it, but we talk about it in many other ways, as if they had the same culture, or they had the same standard of living, or they had the same art, or whatever. In fact, if you go from Estonia to Georgia, should we include Azerbaijan? No, but should we include Azerbaijan? Do we stop at Georgia, or do we? You don't see the same culture. It's like, okay. But so somehow there is an interest in perpetuating this notion that, well, more than 30 years after 1989, there's still, a Central and Eastern group. And so I think it's, to go back to what I said, it's a language to justify reserving capital accumulation to the Atlantic Northwest and to justify limiting Eastern Europe to capital, to labor and resource extraction. And so if I'm right on that, then I'm also right that, at least by Robinson's definition, that is racist. Yeah, I would like to talk about in the next part of if this is true, and if, at least in the Robinson definition, discourses against Eastern Europeans are racist, then why should we not call it racist? Where does this resistance come from? Because there is against calling it racist. So let me say a few things about that. Why not call racism against Eastern Europeans racist? So that's very small. I don't know if you can see. So I just say that it's like one reason I feel is this an emotional provocation. Okay, I don't want to. How should I put this? I have to be very sensitive, and I admit that I myself was against calling it racist. So please don't feel personally attacked if you don't think it's racist. But I would like you to at least ask the question that if you're European, if it's not because you don't think it's possible for you to be thought of the same way as people of color. Okay? So that discourse against you, it must be something else than when people talk about people from Asia or Africa or Latin America. Could that be it? Okay, we can talk about it, but I think that that's part of the reason. There are also other reasons. So what are some of the other reasons? So one of them is that this is imported from the US. This is not just in Eastern Europe. We're not Americans. Race is an American issue. Okay? And American academic imperialists are exporting this idea where it doesn't fit, in Europe. I'm not American, but I'm Canadian, but I think in Europe it's the same. So I'm also perhaps an American imperialist who is exporting this view of race onto Europe. But what is wrong about that is that it ignores the fact that Europe is totally pervaded by racism. And there's not a better word for it. Like the idea against migrants of color, how is that not racist? And in Central Europe, how is the effect of Roma and the violence against them not racist? If that's not racist and you want to put another name on it, why do you want to put another name on it? And also, it ignores the fact that racism actually comes from Europe. According to Cedric Robinson, many other people, and in my book I also try to show that racism originated in Spain and Portugal in the 15th century and was exported into the colonies. So racism is not, race and racism are not strangers to Europe. Okay, another objection might be that to use race in this case is wrong, it's just not linguistically correct. And why change the way we talk about things if we don't have to? Okay, so that it violates usage. But again, this isn't exactly true because if you look at the history of the term race in the English language, it's always been possible, it's old-fashioned now, but it's always been possible to talk about the English race or the French race or the Norwegian race, and race doesn't have to be white and black. Okay, so more recently it has become so, but it's not new in English to talk about race that way. But when we look at German, though, I find that it's really interesting to consider that in German it is not so. Okay, so in German, as far as I know, you couldn't say in the early 18th, 19th century English Rasse. It was always folk, not Rasse. But it becomes Rasse towards the end of the 19th century. It starts to be possible to talk about Slavische Rasse or Germanische Rasse also, not just folk. Like in Hegel, it's folk, but late 19th century language, it becomes Rasse. Okay, and the Nazis had terms like Rassenhygiene, which was about Jews. Okay, and the Nazi anti-Semitism was based on what they called Rassenwissenschaft. Okay, and I think this is a topic that would be very interesting to investigate. We are hearing now how the German consciousness was influenced in its attitude to anti-Semitism to Jews by German colonialism in Namibia, and the genocide in Namibia might have served as a model for the genocide of the Jews. And I'm quite sure that with more research, we would probably find that the move from folk to Rasse, it was a reflection of coloniality. It was importing the language about non-white races back into talking about so-called white races, but they were not the same as white folk, because the Germans never became Rasse, and it's never, as far as I can see, I only did a Google search, but you find very little on Französische Rasse, or even Russische Rasse. But Slavische Rasse, yes. Okay, so I think this was imported back from the colony. Okay, here an illustration from England, from 1899, I believe, a book on races of Europe. It's called Races of Europe by William Ripley. And please have a look at this map, which shows actually the color of skin of peoples all over the world. And you can see that only Northwestern Europe, the British Isles, and Scandinavia are completely white. Everybody else is white, but not quite in Europe. Okay, they're different colorings here show racial differences in Europe. And in the book, you see a list of the races of Europe. So it's not the case that traditionally in Europe, only white and black were recognized as races, because also different white groups were recognized as races. So another objection, that we're talking not about race, but ethnicity. And here I quote another African-American scholar, Thomas Hill, who quipped that race is something blacks have and ethnicity belongs to whites. And he meant that, it's a discriminatory usage. But I think we could take that distinction a little more seriously, and I will mention that Quijano said that ethnicities, unlike races, already existed in Latin America, like Quechua, for example, but that the colonizers collapsed the ethnic groups into racial groups. So they created a supra-ethnic category for their purposes. Now, if we look at Eastern European, it's not an ethnicity. Okay, so it would be wrong to say that racism against Eastern Europeans is racism against some ethnic group, because Eastern Europeans are not an ethnic group. More they are pan-nations, perhaps, and Hannah Arendt paid a lot of attention to this in the formation of fascism in Europe, that pan-nations were important. So Teutons, Slavs, and so forth, they're pan-nations, but Eastern European is not even a pan-nation. Okay, because it includes Slavs and Hungarians and Romanians and Estonians and what have you. Okay, so what Eastern European means in unreflecting language, everyday language, not people who sit down to write definitions, but how they use it. Eastern European means post-communist. in Europe, a post-communist European, is not limited to ethnic groups or pan-nations. Okay, so now I'm coming to the conclusion. Is racism against Eastern Europeans then the same as racism based on color, epidermic racism? And I would have to say no, because they have a different history. I outlined some of it. Before 1989, they were more different maybe than after. But even after 1989, this kind of nearshore offshoring within outsourcing within the European Union and migration of people who have the right to migrate from the European Union is quite different from the exploitation of offshore labor and migration from overseas. And it's easier for an Eastern European migrant to pass so that the next generation might not at all be recognized as Eastern European. That's not the case with people of color. And racism is against Eastern Europeans, it's important to say, is not as cruel and not as systematic. It is systematic, but not as systematic as racism, for example, against Black people. So even though Eastern Europeans are, the phrase goes in between, but actually they're not so in between, but on counts that I just mentioned, they're more part of the West than part of the South. So that what I call white but not quite, and some other people like Burrett speaks of dirty white, is still white. And so we need maybe a better term for this kind of racism against Eastern Europeans. It is racism, but it's racism but not quite. So what I would like to call it is intramural racism. It's one term that comes to my mind, following the work of Walter Mignolo, who uses this term, intramural, meaning within the walls, okay, racism within the walls of whiteness. Okay, thank you very much.